On a dismally wet February morning in 1925, a 45-year-old woman walked along the Thames Embankment, anxious about the meeting she was about to attend. Her family did not know where she was going. She could have turned back and no one would have been any the wiser. If the weather had been a little worse, she might not have made the effort to go out, so the history of radio and television broadcasting probably would have turned out different. Part of her wished she hadn't bothered going, but as Big Ben struck 10 o'clock, she opened the door to the headquarters of the BBC in Savoy Hill and walked in. The BBC didn't move into Broadcasting House until 1932. The nervous figure was Mabel Constanduros. She was a member of the Sutton Amateur Dramatic Club that still operates today. It was as a result of someone seeing her perform one of her monologues on the amateur stage that they suggested she ought to try broadcasting. She was persuaded to go to an audition at the BBC's headquarters. Mabel didn't know what broadcasting meant. The BBC had only been in existence for 2 years. She hadn't even listened to a programme on a wireless set. Mabel knew nothing about the new craze of listening in, which is the term the BBC used for the radio audience tuning into a broadcast. Mabel gave her audition and was so frightened that when she arrived back home, she went to bed. "Don't mention the BBC again, I was a dead failure," she said. At the audition, she had recited a sketch in her character of the Cockney mother of three, Mrs. Emily Buggins. Despite what she thought at the time, Mabel, as we will discover, would become a pioneer of British sitcoms and soap opera. Oh yes, she pioneered soap opera in the UK too. She was incredibly important to the evolution of broadcasting, yet few remember her or have even heard of her. Mabel was born on the 29th of March 1880 in Peckham and had a very comfortable middle-class upbringing in Camberwell. Her father, Richard, was the managing director of a successful horse-drawn bus company built up by his father, Thomas Tilling. The Tilling Bus Company, based in Peckham, became the largest supplier of horsepower in London. Mabel was dissatisfied with the education provided at her finishing school. She made her opinion clear and wrote in her autobiography, "I said so and was not popular." Even from an early age, Mabel wasn't afraid to speak her mind, and this would stand her in good stead later in life. Mabel had what she described as a pleasant life with her parents and no worry about money. She realised she was privileged, thinking her life was too sheltered. After all, young women in that time were led to believe that being married was all that was needed for a woman to live happily ever after. Marriage was inevitable. Mabel married London-born Anastasius Constanduros in 1907 when Mabel was 27. Mabel's sister Gertrude married his brother Stephanos. They lived together in St George's Road, Worthing in Sussex. Mabel had a son, Anthony, but he died aged 4. Another child miscarried or was stillborn. She had a third child, Michael, in 1917. Then in 1921, the family moved to Cheam in Surrey. Mabel's parents had been against the idea of her going on the stage, so in about 1923 she went to the Central School of Speech Training and Dramatic Art based at the Royal Albert Hall in London. Mabel credits her teacher Mrs. Fogarty with persuading her to write her monologues, and it was perhaps her approval that gave Mabel the courage to go to the audition that would lead to a new life. At some point, Mabel separated from her husband. There's no evidence of a divorce, but her nephew Dennis, who would later become co-writer with her, felt there could not have been two more incompatible personalities. Anastasius died in 1937. Before we look at Mabel's involvement in sitcoms, we need to establish what we mean by the term sitcom. The word sitcom is a portmanteau of situation and comedy. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, neither situation comedy nor sitcom were terms in common usage until the 1950s. The American publication TV Guide appears to be among the first general circulation publications to use the term situation comedy in print. In the 23rd of October 1953 issue, it used the expression 14 times, so the phrase was already in common use. There is evidence of the term being used in the UK before then. In a memo from BBC radio comedy producer Peter Eaton, dated the 31st of March 1953, he suggested the situation comedy format as ideal for Tony Hancock's comedic style. This indicates the term was in use within British broadcasting circles at least around that time. The OED's earliest evidence for Sitcom, a two-word abbreviation, is from the Variety magazine 26th of September 1956, where it said, "The perils of filming situation comedies in a day and age when all the odds are against the sitcom format." The abbreviated form sitcom as one word is dated in print by the OED only as far back as a 1964 Life magazine article announcing Bing Crosby's upcoming show that ran from September 1964 to April 1965. I looked at the definitions of sitcom in over 20 dictionaries and a dozen online references and scholarly works. All the definitions are different, but there are prevalent descriptors in many of the definitions of sitcom. But remember, art defies definition. It embraces a vast range of forms, styles and interpretations. This inherent fluidity makes it challenging to create a single all-encompassing definition. So by general agreement, a sitcom is typically set in a familiar, realistic environment like a home, workplace or a meeting place, has multiple short episodes, each presenting a self-contained storyline or subplot, with a regular cast of relatable principal characters, involved in humorous misunderstandings and often exaggerated comic situations, having witty dialogue, comedic timing and recurring jokes. A sitcom might be recorded entirely in a studio with or without an audience, or shot entirely on location, or a combination of studio and location filming. Sitcoms can be contrasted with sketch comedy, where an ensemble perform different characters in a collection of unrelated sketches like Monty Python or The Fast Show, and stand-up comedy where a comedian tells jokes and stories directly to an audience. As we will see, early sitcoms do not precisely fit the definition, but then the entire broadcast landscape was different. In the early days of radio, shows were not always part of a regular series, and the broadcast days and times of editions could vary from week to week. The only programmes you could rely on being at a regular time were the news and weather bulletins, usually at 6 p.m. and 9 p.m. So the regular broadcast times of the sitcom description did not originally apply. Also, the typical half-hour format was not present from the start, but the main elements were always there. The connected group of people, most often a family unit and their close relatives, in relatable comic situations, who returned in each subsequent episode. So now we know what we mean by a sitcom, so let's look at the earliest influences on this style of performance. Before radio and television, there was musical in the UK and vaudeville in America. Musical was popular in the Victorian era from about 1850. Vaudeville originated in France in the late 1800s, becoming popular in the United States and Canada around 1880. Both forms of entertainment were broadly similar, being a combination of unrelated performers, including singers, musicians, comedians, ventriloquists, magicians and dancers. They also both originated in bars, moving to theatres as the entertainment form became more popular. In the 1920s, cinemas started to attract audiences away from these shows, while listening to the radio was also becoming popular. As both forms of live theatre entertainment were declining, many of the performers transferred to making movies and talkies, and some progressed to radio and television. This would explain why early radio and television broadcasts resembled variety shows. Even the descriptions of the acts in the Radio Times are reminiscent of the style of variety show epithets seen in theatre posters. Radio was a new medium. No one yet knew how else to structure and publicise shows. Many of the stars came from musical, and it's likely they or their agents wanted to preserve their brand image. Probably the earliest example of a performer as a recurring sitcom-like character was the French actor-director Gabriel Louvel, known professionally as Max Linder. He created a character called Max, a dapper man about town who appeared in a series of short comedy films from 1905. He has the distinction of being cited as the first international movie star and the first film star anywhere. The Max character was the Mr. Bean of his day, and his silent film, The Skater's Debut, predates Charlie Chaplin's version, The Rink, by 9 years. Sadly, it appears Lavelle took his own life aged 41, and on receiving the news of his death, Chaplin is reported to have closed his studio for one day out of respect. Laurel and Hardy might be more recognisable early film stars that were in sitcom-like settings. Although Stanley Laurel and Oliver Hardy had both been in films since 1914 and 1917 respectively, their first film together as the Stan and Ollie characters was Duck Soup in 1927. The duo appeared in over 100 films up to 1951. While not always appearing in the same guises, many other actors like Mae Bush, Tiny Sanford, Edgar Kennedy and James Finlayson regularly appeared with them. Back to that wet February morning in 1925 when Mabel left the BBC headquarters. She didn't realise it, but she had made a good impression as she was offered her first commission for an original script and performance. Station director Kenneth Wright was prepared to pay 2 guineas provided that the material was original and the BBC would not have to pay any copyright for it. Wright then decided to increase the fee to 3 guineas. A few weeks later, as Mabel says in her autobiography, they sent for me again and told me that they proposed to make me a star, which meant 5 guineas. The 50-minute play was called An Hour in Spring and was broadcast on Friday the 1st of May 1925 at 8:45 p.m. Her next few broadcasts were as a cast member in other productions. Then she had another play broadcast on Saturday the 18th of July 1925 at 9 p.m. titled A Day in the Country. We've no way of knowing if these were comic or straight plays. Mabel's first sketch specifically billed as a comedy was In the Tram, broadcast on Monday the 3rd of August at 8 p.m, listed in Radio Times as a comedy dialogue of low life. In the early days of BBC Radio, the corporation broadcast different schedules of programmes from 18 regional transmitters. This meant that a programme might only have been heard by people tuned into the transmitter for their area. Some programmes were relayed live to other transmitters or repeated on other transmitters at another date and time. By December 1928, there were 11 transmitters due to some being replaced by higher power aerials. From the start of World War II in September 1939, the BBC rationalised the broadcasts to one national schedule on the BBC Home Service. On Wednesday the 26th of August 1925, the Radio Times lists 2 5-minute episodes by Mabel Constanduros. Mrs. Smythe Brown buys a book and Mrs. Buggins chooses a hat. These were both repeated on the 29th of August 1925. The Radio Times does not mention the Buggins family in the title or description of any of Mabel's earlier broadcasts, so Mrs. Buggins Chooses a Hat is likely the first broadcast of what was to become the world's first sitcom, but no one knew it yet. The characters were all voiced by Mabel, with Michael Hogan as the rarely heard husband. The stories featured a hard-pressed mother, indifferent father and 3 recalcitrant children, with a lot of the comedy coming from the eccentric grandma. The next Buggins story was on the 1st of September 1925, titled The Buggins Family Out for the Day. Most sources cite this as the first Buggins broadcast. Although the Buggins episodes are described as sketches, they are closer to what we would now call a sitcom, in much the same way that the original Simpsons cartoon series started as a 2-minute animated sketch on the Tracy Ullman Show. Mabel's appearance on the Variety Show on the 15th of December 1925 sees Mabel billed in a listing saying, with radio favourites, so she's now firmly established as an artist well known and liked by the public. Mabel was a star. Mabel's stories were popular with the public and BBC management. She signed a contract on the 19th of January 1926 when a fee of 10 guineas was agreed for the play Devoted Elsie. It was billed as a radio comedy and first broadcast on the 5th of February 1926. Incidentally, it is claimed that the six-part series That Child by Florence Kilpatrick that premiered on the 27th of April 1926, in which Mabel was a performer, was the first sitcom-type programme. However, there had already been 2 Buggins family stories broadcast by that time. Although the next Buggins episode would not be until the 23rd of June 1926, the Buggins family was already established in much the same way as nowadays, when a pilot episode of a television show can be aired months or even years ahead of the full series being broadcast. Some sources say that Mabel wrote over 250 Buggins episodes. While it's true that there are at least 257 mentions in the Radio Times of Mabel performing as the Buggins family, some of those entries do not name a specific story, and some were repeated many times. Still, there were a lot of Buggins episodes, and they were popular. Mabel was such a big radio celebrity that she had her own one-hour show in the primetime slot of 7:30 on the 24th of December 1926 for Mrs. Buggins Gives a Christmas Party. She also had a 45-minute Christmas party episode on Saturday the 24th of December 1927. Mabel and the Buggins family were a regular feature on the Children's Hour broadcasts from February 1927 to May 1937. From September to November 1928, the Buggins family regularly appeared on the vaudeville radio variety show. Only short excerpts of the Buggins survive in the archives, but Mabel did release some episodes on 10 and 12-inch 78 RPM records. A selection were re-released on CD in 2009. In the late 1920s, the musical circuit was still more lucrative than radio, so Mabel was tempted onto the stage with a 12-week tour contract. In her autobiography, she says, "I was engaged to top the bill at the Coliseum, and I felt no triumph at all. I was just terror-stricken. This was a job of which I knew nothing." Subsequently, she played a variety of roles in London theatres and on tour, including Mrs. Bones in the light opera Derby Day at the Lyric Theatre, Hammersmith in 1932, and Anne of Cleves in The Rose Without a Thorn at the Duke of York's Theatre in 1933. She returned to the BBC's vaudeville show and also appeared on The Kitchen Front from June 1929 to July 1931. In 1929, British Sound Film Productions made a 12-minute film titled Ag and Bert, featuring Mabel as Aggie Buggins and Michael Horgan as Bert. This appears to be an adaptation of a sketch they performed in the music halls. In the 1930s and 40s, Mabel appeared in feature films. Mabel and Dennis wrote the play Acacia Avenue that ran for a year in the Vaudeville Theatre in the West End of London. It was then adapted as the 1945 feature film 29 Acacia Avenue. Mabel's first TV appearance was one of the test transmissions using the Baird process on Wednesday the 12th of April 1933. The BBC's and the world's first regular high-definition television service officially started on Monday the 2nd of November 1936. In 1953, Mabel reprised her radio children's hour role as Earthly Mangold in Wurzel Gummidge in a 4-part television adaptation. Mabel's friend and fellow actress Griselda Hervey asked her to go to Hollywood with her. They travelled to New York on the ocean liner SS Normandy on the 2nd of December 1936, arriving on the 7th of December. After seeing the sights in New York, they went by train to Chicago. Mabel described New York as superlative. Certainly one feels there that one is living in a film or stage set. Then Mabel fell in love with Los Angeles. During her trip, Mabel was entertained by some of the biggest stars of the day, including Errol Flynn, P.G. Wodehouse and Shirley Temple. Mabel's fame meant that she even featured on a set of cigarette cards produced by the Wills Tobacco Company, along the likes of Marlene Dietrich and Noel Coward. After 2 months, Mabel returned to England as her son Michael needed an operation for appendicitis. It was while she was in Los Angeles that she was inspired by a family drama, or what we would now call a soap opera. They had been popular in the US from the early 1930s, so Mabel, with her nephew Dennis, created the English Family Robinson, first broadcast in 1937. Radio Times billed it, saying their weekly adventures will be those that may have happened to thousands of listeners and their families during the week. Though nothing sensational is likely to happen to them, you will probably soon feel that you know them as well as you know anybody. It was just a 6-episode series, but it was an immediate success and spawned many more radio soaps. And then in 1954, the first UK television soap, The Grove Family. Mabel was asked to make shows for forces and home service radio during World War II. The Kitchen Front started broadcasting 6 days a week from the 25th of June 1940 on the BBC Home Service Basic Channel. Mabel joined the show every Tuesday from the 28th of October 1941. Originally, Grandma or Emily Buggins simply read through a recipe, but in 1942 Mabel developed this into Grandma reading the recipe and Emily asking questions to discuss the availability of ingredients or to ask for more tips. Mabel's appearances on the Kitchen Front were an important contribution to the war effort. It also ensured her continued relevance on radio and boosted her celebrity status. As well as joining the Kitchen Front programme with the Buggins family, Mabel and Dennis also adapted The English Family Robinson for wartime audiences. While Mabel had established the sitcom format in August 1925 with Mrs. Buggins Chooses a Hat, it was not until 1946 that the first television sitcom was aired, 10 years after the official start of BBC television broadcasts. Most people believe television sitcoms started in America with I Love Lucy. However, American television channel CBS was actively appropriating ideas from the BBC. This gave rise to the assumption that I Love Lucy producer William Asher was the man who invented sitcom. The world's first television sitcom was the BBC show Pinwright's Progress. It starred character actor James Hayter as Mr. Pinwright, owner of the smallest department store in the world. 10 30-minute episodes were broadcast live from the BBC studios at Alexandra Palace between November 1946 and May 1947. The series was written by Rodney Hobson and was edited by Itmar writer Ted Kavanagh. It was a genius idea to set the show in a department store, as this gave endless opportunities for interactions with different customers in each episode, in addition to the chaotic activities of the department store staff. As it was broadcast live, there is nothing in the archives to see apart from a few photographs and the brief episode summaries in the Radio Times. The first sitcom in the USA started as a shopping channel in 1947 with real-life married couple Mary Kay and Johnny Stearns. They were sponsored by J. Jostle, a clothing manufacturer, to model their range on their weekly 15-minute show called JJ Junior Dresses. Johnny had the idea to write a script about the comic exploits of a newlywed couple like themselves, which became the Mary Kay and Johnny Show. They would use Jostle's products in the show and Jostle would continue to sponsor it. The day after the first show aired, there were nearly 8,000 orders for items in the show. They had only expected a few hundred. Eventually the show was bought by the Dumont television network and they made nearly 300 episodes over the next 3 years. Early shows were recorded on a film camera focused on a television monitor. Almost all of these tele-recordings were disposed of. Only 2 are believed to have survived. Still in America and in 1951, I Love Lucy came to screens. Lucille Ball's character wants to be a showbiz star and her many attempts to be famous result in chaos and failure. The shows were pre-recorded, filmed on cinema 35mm film, meaning that the quality was better than the Mary Kay and Johnny tele-recordings. Husband and wife co-stars Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz formed Desilu Studios, which meant they owned the copyright of the show, and it still earns royalties for the current rights holder, CBS Broadcasting Incorporated. Back to the UK, and one of the best known early sitcoms was Hancock's Half Hour, starting on BBC Radio in 1954 and uniquely with alternating BBC Radio and BBC television series from 1956, then exclusively on television in 1960 and 61. The shows were written by Ray Galton and Alan Simpson. Hancock played Anthony Aloysius St John Hancock, an exaggerated version of himself, with Sid James as a regular co-star, except in the final series. The radio and television series had some regular performers, including Kenneth Williams, Bill Kerr and Hattie Jakes, usually playing the same characters but occasionally adopting different guises. Hancock parted ways with Galton Simpson, so they accepted a commission from the BBC to write the first comedy playhouse series, broadcast in 1962. One of the episodes was titled The Offer. It was something of a budget production, as they'd overspent on sets and performers for other episodes in the series, so they concentrated on two actors, Wilfred Bramble and Harry H. Corbett, and one set, their home. It worked, and it became the series Steptoe and Son. The intergenerational conflict of father and son and the constant attempt by Harold to improve his life, being repeatedly thwarted by his father, ran for 8 series and 4 feature films. Mabel had a meteoric rise to fame. She was an actor, writer of novels, over 100 plays and musicals, and wrote adaptations of classic works, often with her nephew Dennis. Mabel had the distinction of being the first comic to be paid the substantial sum of 5 guineas per show by the BBC. In her early appearances, Mabel was billed as Mabel Constanduros, entertainer or impressionist. Then, in 1928, she was the famous radio entertainer. In 1941, she was well enough known to be referred to as Mrs. Buggins or the Buggins family. Then in 1946, she was called a variety star. In 1959, posthumously, Mabel was credited as famous broadcasting personality. So, why hasn't she had the same level of recognition of other early broadcasters, radio stars and BBC bosses? To help explain, let me list a few names of BBC people that you are likely to have heard of. John Reith, Sir Cecil Graves, David Attenborough, Frank Muir, Sir Hugh Carlton Green, Alistair Milne, Michael Grade, Sir Michael Checkland. I think you can see there is a pattern forming, but how about comic Tommy Handley, band leaders Jack Payne and Charles Shadwell, musical comedy performers Mr. Flotsam and Mr. Jetsam, comic and actor Will Hay, film and theatre actor Nelson Keys, and comic Bob Monkhouse. I'm certain you've heard of a few of them. They were just some of the performers that Mabel worked with at one time or another. It's widely understood now that women haven't always been treated equally, and this includes the world of comedy writing. In her book Women and Laughter, author Frances Gray points out that for a long time, most sitcoms were written by men. It seemed like women weren't considered as important contributors to comedy. Even when the Sutton Amateur Dramatic Club celebrated their 100th production in 1949 and mentioned in the programme some of their past performers that had become famous, Mabel wasn't mentioned by name. Instead, she was referred to as the little lady playing with Leslie Howard, was later to immortalise the Buggins family. When Mabel discovered she was not paid as much as the men she worked with, she complained, "I still think I'm being paid too little." This must have been quite surprising for the men in charge. In the 1920s and 1930s, when John Reith was in charge of the BBC, women's achievements weren't often reported in the newspapers. It was as if their ideas weren't considered important. This has made it difficult for historians today to learn about the many talented women who worked at the BBC. Mabel's emphasis on everyday subjects and ordinary families influenced the shape of sitcoms and soap operas in Britain. Mabel was taken to the nation's hearts during the early days of radio, through the Second World War and until the 1950s. Her visionary work in both writing and performing enhanced entertainment on the BBC, and according to author Jennifer Purcell, made her Mother of the BBC. She continued to entertain audiences until she was hospitalised following a heart attack in December 1956. Mabel passed away on the 8th of February 1957 at the Royal West Sussex Hospital, Chichester in Sussex. The funeral was on the 13th of February 1957 at St John the Evangelist Churchyard, Bury, in Sussex, where her ashes were laid. At Mabel's request, there was no gravestone. As there was no physical memorial, it's a shame, despite her friends and employees at the BBC wanting to commemorate her life on the radio, that BBC management decided against it. In 1988, BBC Radio 4 broadcast a programme including rare recordings of Mabel's work along with other radio pioneers. Then in 1991, Radio 2 included Mabel in a series reviewing the careers of women in 1930s and 1940s entertainment. In 2005, Radio 4's The Late Mrs Buggins looked at her pioneering career. Then, in 2023, 67 years after her last live appearance on Woman's Hour, the programme reviewed her life's work and finally asked the question, why has history forgotten her? I hope you've enjoyed this look at Mabel's life. Leave a like and let me know if you remember her or her Buggins family stories in the comments below. Thanks for watching.